June 6th, 1944, Normandy, France. The beaches were a scene of chaos, courage, and carnage. Thousands of soldiers poured onto the sands under a storm of bullets and shells. The Allies had crossed the English Channel to liberate Europe, but the fight had only just begun. Inland, a different kind of obstacle awaited, one that no map, no artillery, and no general's plan could have fully prepared for. They were the hedgerows, thick, centuries-old walls of earth, stone, and tangled roots, stretching endlessly across the Normandy countryside. Some stood 15 feet tall, roots plunging deep into the soil, creating a natural fortress. For centuries, farmers had built them to mark their land. Now, in the summer of 1944, they had turned into killing fields. American tanks, the Sherman workhorses of the battlefield, approached these earthen walls with determination. But every time a tank tried to climb over, its belly armour, the weakest, most vulnerable part, was exposed. German soldiers, hidden behind these hedges, were waiting. Anti-tank weapons struck like lightning. One shot, one kill, and the Sherman crews paid the price. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this nightmare unfold every day. Flames erupted, tanks burned, medics scrambled, and soldiers screamed. The advance, which was supposed to push 30 miles inland by now, had stalled to a crawl, sometimes just a few hundred yards a day. Allied commanders were frustrated, logistics strained, and morale wavered. For Cullen, a mechanic from New Jersey with no formal engineering degree, the problem was clear. He didn't see the hedgerows as walls, he saw them as machines, stubborn machinery built to resist force, and he had an idea. What if tanks didn't have to climb over these hedges? What if they could go through them, tearing a path straight across without exposing their vulnerable undersides? It was audacious. It was crazy. But in war, sometimes crazy ideas are the ones that save lives. And for Sergeant Cullen, the clock was ticking. Every day spent stalled behind these hedgerows meant more men dying. He had to act, and fast. Sergeant Curtis Cullen wasn't a polished engineer. He had never attended MIT. He didn't carry blueprints in his pocket or a toolbox designed for high-level design. What he did have was grit, intuition, and a mind that refused to accept defeat. Day after day, he watched his comrades try and fail to breach the Normandy hedgerows. Every burned Sherman, every casualty, every stalled advance added fuel to his frustration. To most men, the hedgerows were impenetrable. To Cullen, they were a problem waiting for the right solution. In the small hours, under flickering kerosene lamps in a makeshift workshop behind the front lines, he began experimenting. Pieces of scrap metal, old bulldozer blades, tank parts, anything he could salvage. He welded, hammered, and twisted them into crude shapes. He sketched ideas on any scrap of paper he could find, diagrams littered with arrows, measurements, and cryptic notes in his messy handwriting. The concept was simple in theory, revolutionary in practice. Attach a steel teeth, or plow, to the front of the Sherman tank. It would dig into the earth and roots of the hedgerow, tearing through it like a knife through cloth. The tank wouldn't climb over the hedge anymore. It would burrow straight through, armour intact, men inside safer. Of course, many officers called it madness. "You'll ruin the tank," they said. "It'll get stuck, or worse, you'll get yourself killed." But Cullen had something they didn't. He'd seen the hedge walls from the inside, felt the death beneath the soil, and knew that the risk of doing nothing was far greater. He found allies in unexpected places. A few forward-thinking tank commanders, tired of watching their men fall one by one, agreed to test his creation. The first prototypes were crude, almost laughable. A jagged blade welded to the front of a Sherman, uneven and untested. But when Cullen fired it into the first hedgerow, something incredible happened. The tank ripped through the barrier, crushing roots and earth beneath its tracks. Inside, the crew was shaken but alive. The destroyed hedgerow revealed a path forward, and suddenly the nightmare of the hedgerows didn't seem so insurmountable. Cullen's mad idea worked. Word of the Cullen device, as soldiers began to call it, spread quickly across the front lines. Commanders, initially sceptical, now demanded to see these machines in action. And Cullen, the mechanic who had refused to be beaten by nature itself, was about to change the course of the Normandy campaign. With the Cullen device finally welded onto a handful of Sherman tanks, it was time to test them under the harshest conditions imaginable: combat. Curtis Cullen himself didn't hesitate to ride in the first modified tank, determined to see his creation in action. The morning was foggy, the kind of fog that swallowed sounds and shapes, making the hedgerows loom like impenetrable walls. Soldiers crouched in foxholes, gripping rifles, waiting for the assault. The modified Sherman rumbled forward, its steel teeth glinting in the weak sunlight. Every man in the unit held his breath. At first, the tank hesitated, the blade biting into soil and roots. Then, with a roar of metal against earth, it surged forward. The hedgerow split apart like paper, roots snapping, earth flying. Men cheered, a mix of disbelief and relief echoing across the battlefield. For the first time they could see a clear path through the seemingly endless green maze of Normandy. Cullen's madness was proving its worth. Word spread quickly. Tank crews who had once cursed the hedgerows now clamoured for a chance to ride in these new machines. Even high-ranking officers, who had doubted the feasibility of attaching a plow to a tank, were forced to acknowledge the genius in its simplicity. The impact was immediate. German defences, designed to trap and destroy advancing Allied units, found themselves suddenly vulnerable. The modified Shermans cut paths through hedgerows that had previously slowed or halted entire battalions. Infantry could advance behind armoured support, casualties dropped, and morale soared. Soldiers began calling the modified Shermans Hedgerow Busters, and they became a symbol of ingenuity triumphing over adversity. Yet, the story wasn't without risk. Early deployments exposed flaws. Some tanks got stuck if the ground was too soft. Others suffered structural damage to their frontal armour from the constant strain. But Curtis Cullen was there, tirelessly observing, adjusting and improving. Each failure taught him something new. A slightly longer blade here, reinforced brackets there, until the tanks were not just effective but reliable under real combat conditions. The battlefield, which had once seemed like a maze of death, was slowly being tamed by a man who refused to see a problem he couldn't solve. Curtis Cullen, the mechanic labelled as Mad, was no longer just a tinkerer behind the lines. He had become a legend, an unsung hero whose mind and determination saved lives and accelerated the Allied advance. And as the sun set over the shattered fields of Normandy, the tanks continued their work. Steel tore through earth, engines roared, and soldiers who had once felt trapped by nature now pushed forward with hope. The genius of one man had shifted the odds of an entire campaign. News of the Hedgerow Busters travelled fast. What had begun as Curtis Cullen's personal experiment quickly caught the attention of Allied commanders. Reports from the front lines described tanks tearing through the hedgerows with startling efficiency, opening pathways where infantry had previously faced deadly ambushes. Soldiers spoke in awe of these machines, praising their resilience and ingenuity. High command realised the potential immediately. Plans were drawn up to equip entire battalions with the modified Shermans. Workshops back in England and France worked around the clock, producing ploughs and reinforcing tank armour to withstand the rigours of constant hedgerow combat. Mechanics who had never met Cullen were now replicating his designs, following his meticulous sketches and notes. For the first time in the Normandy campaign, the Allies had a decisive tool to counter the natural defensive advantages of the German positions. The hedgerows, once seen as nearly impenetrable obstacles, were now mere bumps on the battlefield. Tanks could carve paths, artillery could be brought closer to the front, and infantry units moved with newfound confidence. The impact was dramatic. Entire German positions that had previously slowed Allied progress collapsed under coordinated attacks, supported by the Hedgerow Busters. Supply lines became easier to establish, communication between units improved, and the momentum of the Allied advance picked up. What had seemed like a stagnant, deadly slog through Normandy's countryside transformed into a series of calculated, advancing movements. Yet the soldiers never forgot the man behind it all. Curtis Cullen became something of a legend, whispered about in mess halls and written about in letters home. He was a quiet hero, someone whose mind and ingenuity saved lives without ever stepping into the spotlight. His madness, the idea that a simple plough could alter the course of battles, was now seen as genius. Despite the widespread adoption, challenges remained. Some terrain was too soft, some hedgerows too thick, and German defences adapted quickly. But every problem presented an opportunity for Cullen and his fellow engineers to improve the design. Each iteration of the Hedgerow Buster became more efficient, more reliable, and more feared by enemy forces. By mid-1944, the modified tanks had shifted the balance in Normandy. What started as a single mechanic's bold experiment had become a critical asset in one of history's most significant campaigns. Cullen's work demonstrated a powerful truth. Sometimes, ingenuity and determination can outweigh sheer numbers and firepower. One man's vision had changed the course of a battle, and possibly the war itself. The war eventually ended, but the story of Curtis Cullen and his Hedgerow Busters did not. After victory in Europe, Cullen returned home quietly, without fanfare or medals, content to watch the world rebuild. Yet his work had already left an indelible mark on military engineering. Military historians and engineers studied the Normandy campaign in the years that followed, dissecting what had made the Allied advance possible. The Hedgerow Buster was repeatedly cited as a turning point, a case study in improvisation and the power of inventive thinking. Cullen's approach, looking at a problem not as it was but as it could be, became a guiding principle for battlefield innovation. In tank design, the influence was clear. Later generations of armoured vehicles were built with adaptability in mind. Engineers learned to anticipate obstacles not as static challenges, but as opportunities for modification and enhancement. From plows to specialised armour, many modern tank innovations trace conceptual roots back to the Mad Mechanic and his battlefield experiments. Beyond machinery, Cullen's story inspired countless soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike. Letters from veterans recounted the hope that one man's creativity brought in the darkest hours of war. Soldiers remembered the tanks not just as machines but as symbols of ingenuity, a reminder that even in the chaos of battle, human intellect could turn the tide. In schools of engineering and military academies, Cullen's methods became examples of thinking outside the box under pressure. His story, once a whispered legend among soldiers, entered textbooks and lectures. It was not just a tale of war, it was a story of resilience, determination, and the power of imagination. Curtis Cullen never sought fame, but his legacy endured. Museums displayed photographs of the modified Shermans, and historians chronicled the evolution of armoured warfare that his experiments helped spark. The nickname Mad Mechanic persisted, not as an insult, but as a badge of honour, an acknowledgement that genius often looks like madness to those who cannot see the vision behind it. Even today, when tanks roll into exercises or museums showcase World War II technology, the Hedgerow Buster serves as a reminder. One individual's creativity can change the course of history, proving that courage is not only found on the battlefield, but in the workshop, the garage, or anywhere a problem meets a determined mind. The men who rode into Normandy in Cullen's modified Shermans had a unique perspective. For them, the Hedgerow Buster was more than a machine. It was a lifeline, a symbol of ingenuity that gave them a fighting chance against entrenched German defences. Private James "Jimmy" O'Connor, a tank crewman, later recounted in letters that the first time they charged a hedgerow, the tank groaned and shook, its reinforced plough biting through the dense earth like a bulldozer. Bullets ricocheted off the hull, yet the Buster pressed forward, tearing a path for infantry behind it. Jimmy described a mix of terror and awe. It was like riding a beast that knew exactly what it had to do. It wasn't perfect, but it never failed us. Sergeant Wilhelm Becker, a German prisoner who later gave testimony after the war, remembered seeing these tanks from the other side. He wrote that the modified Sherman seemed almost alive, crashing through hedgerows that had stalled entire units for days. "We knew they were coming, but we couldn't stop them," Becker said. "Those tanks were unstoppable." The crews often had to improvise on the spot. Field repairs became routine. Hydraulic leaks, broken treads, or jammed ploughs demanded quick thinking. Cullen's philosophy had trickled down to every soldier operating the tanks: adapt, repair, survive. Soldiers learned to read the machine like a living partner, anticipating its quirks and limitations. Amid the chaos of Normandy, small moments revealed the human side of this mechanical marvel. Crews would paint little mascots or nicknames on their tanks, a tradition dating back to early armoured units. One Sherman carried a small hand-painted frog on its plough, a symbol of luck, they said. Another had the words "Cullen's Revenge" scrawled across its side, a tribute to the mechanic who gave them the tools to survive impossible odds. Life inside the Hedgerow Buster was tight, hot, and perilous. Yet soldiers carried a sense of pride. They weren't just operating a tank, they were part of an experiment in courage and creativity. Each successful breach of a hedgerow wasn't just a tactical victory, it was proof that human ingenuity could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. These personal stories, recorded in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, bring Cullen's engineering to life. They show that a machine, no matter how well designed, only reaches its full potential when paired with human bravery, quick thinking, and camaraderie. The Hedgerow Buster wasn't just a tool of war, it was a vessel of hope, ingenuity, and survival, carrying men through one of history's deadliest campaigns. By mid-1944, Cullen's modified Shermans had become an indispensable tool for the Allies. The hedgerows of Normandy had been a nightmare for planners' natural fortresses that slowed advances and funneled troops into deadly kill zones. But with the Buster, the Allies began to regain momentum. The Battle of Saint-Lô is often cited as a turning point. The town sat behind a maze of thick hedgerows, each concealing German anti-tank guns and infantry. Previous assaults had stalled for days, costing hundreds of lives. But Cullen's tanks changed the rules. Crews charged forward, plows digging through earth barriers that had seemed impenetrable. Soldiers described the scene as almost surreal. The tanks crashed through hedgerows like battering rams, carving paths for infantry to follow. At one point, a unit led by Lieutenant Robert Bob Hanley faced a particularly thick hedgerow, blocking access to a strategically vital crossroads. Previous attempts had ended in disaster, but Hanley's unit, equipped with busters, pushed forward. One by one, the tanks tore through the obstacles, their engines roaring, dust and debris flying like a storm. By the end of the day, the crossroads were secured, opening a critical supply route. Hanley later wrote, "Without those tanks, we would have been stuck there for weeks. They didn't just break hedgerows, they broke the enemy's resolve." Elsewhere, during the fierce fight for Carentan, soldiers recounted seeing entire German positions crumble under the onslaught of these modified machines. The combination of mobility, ploughing power, and armour meant that entrenched positions no longer guaranteed safety. The tanks gave infantry units a chance to advance without being pinned down, saving countless lives and accelerating the liberation of key towns. Yet these victories came at a cost. Crews faced constant danger from mines, artillery, and sniper fire. The Hedgerow Buster, though stronger than standard Shermans, was still vulnerable. But soldiers often remarked on the confidence it inspired. When facing a fortified hedgerow, fear remained. But the Buster gave them a fighting chance, a sense that ingenuity and courage could prevail against overwhelming odds. Cullen's contribution didn't just change battles, it changed the mindset of Allied forces. Where soldiers had once hesitated, now they advanced with determination. The Hedgerow Buster became a symbol of adaptability, a tangible reminder that one man's creativity could influence the course of an entire campaign. By the end of the Normandy campaign, countless hedgerows lay shattered, towns liberated, and soldiers alive thanks to the machine that had once been a pile of broken metal in Cullen's workshop. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the world began to take stock of the sacrifices and innovations that had defined the war. Soldiers returned home, battlefields were cleared, and nations began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Amid all this, Cullen returned to his quiet workshop, far from the parades and headlines, a man whose greatest contribution had been forged in secrecy and steel. Unlike some war heroes, Cullen never sought fame. He rarely spoke publicly about the Hedgerow Buster or his other modifications, content to know that soldiers had survived and missions had succeeded because of his ingenuity. Yet those who knew him remembered a man of intense curiosity and relentless determination. He could spend hours tinkering with engines, analysing armour thickness, or improvising solutions from scraps others would have discarded. To the people in his hometown, he was simply the guy who could fix anything, unaware that the machines he had breathed new life into had changed history. After the war, Cullen continued to work in engineering, applying the same inventive mindset to civilian projects. Bridges, tractors, and industrial machinery benefited from his insight. Yet, in quiet moments, he would sometimes reflect on the tanks, the broken hulls he had transformed into legends, the soldiers who had lived because of a plow welded onto a Sherman's frame. He never imagined those machines would be studied decades later in military schools, or that enthusiasts would write articles and documentaries praising his work. The legacy of Cullen's Hedgerow Buster stretches far beyond Normandy. Modern armoured engineering and combat vehicle design owe much to the philosophy he embodied. adaptation, innovation, and bold experimentation in the face of impossible challenges. Military historians still cite the Buster as a prime example of how field ingenuity can alter the outcome of campaigns, a reminder that technology alone isn't enough. Human creativity matters just as much. Cullen's story is also a human story. It shows how one person's passion and refusal to accept limitations can ripple outward, saving lives and inspiring future generations. In a war defined by destruction, his creations were instruments not just of battle, but of hope, resourcefulness, and resilience. Soldiers who rode into Normandy behind those modified Shermans carried not only guns and armour, but also the quiet genius of a mechanic who refused to see obstacles as permanent. Today, museums and memorials honour the machines and the men who fought with them. Yet behind every plaque, every restored Sherman, every photograph of a Hedgerow Buster tearing through the French countryside, is Cullen the Mad Mechanic, whose stubborn brilliance turned broken tanks into engineering legends. His story reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected places, and that courage isn't always measured by battlefield heroics. Sometimes it's measured by the courage to think differently and build something extraordinary from nothing. War is often measured in strategy, battles, and statistics, but the real story is told by the men who lived through it. For the soldiers who climbed into Cullen's modified Shermans, the experience was unforgettable. Private Thomas Riley, a tank driver from New Jersey, later recounted in letters to his family, "I've driven many tanks, but nothing felt like the one we got from Cullen's workshop. The hedgerow plow, it tore through obstacles like paper. We survived ambushes that should have ended us. I don't know who he was at the time, but I owe my life to him." Others spoke of the ingenuity that seemed almost magical. When a Sherman lost a track during a patrol, soldiers improvised repairs using parts salvaged from nearby wrecks. Cullen's modifications made these makeshift solutions possible. The tanks weren't just machines, they were partners in survival, built to adapt to the chaos of war. Sergeant Emile Laurent, who led a squad through Normandy's dense hedgerows, described the moment he first saw a Hedgerow Buster in action. "We had been stuck for hours, pinned down by German fire. Then this Sherman with a strange plough on the front ripped through a hedge like it wasn't even there. I couldn't believe my eyes. That day, we pushed forward because of a mechanic no one had ever heard of." Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal a recurring theme. Cullen's tanks didn't just survive, they inspired confidence. Soldiers trusted them in ways they rarely trusted other machines. They were faster to repair, stronger against ambushes, and most importantly designed by someone who understood both the machine and the men who rode it. Some veterans even attributed their courage to Cullen indirectly. Knowing that the tank in front of them had been meticulously engineered by a man who cared about every weld and every rivet gave them a sense of security that bullets and shells alone could never provide. It was a quiet form of heroism, mechanical, precise, and life-saving. Even decades later, reunions of Sherman crews often feature stories of the Mad Mechanic. Soldiers share anecdotes about the plough that tore through walls, the engine that kept running despite battle damage, or the day a tank miraculously survived direct fire. These tales highlight a truth that Cullen's story embodies. War is not just won by armies, but by the inventiveness and determination of individuals behind the scenes. Through these voices, Cullen's work gains a human dimension. The tanks weren't just feats of engineering, they were lifelines, symbols of ingenuity, and a testament to the bond between those who build and those who fight. To truly appreciate Cullen's impact, we need to look under the hood literally. His most famous innovation, the Hedgerow Buster, wasn't just a crude plough slapped on a tank. It was a meticulously engineered solution to a deadly problem. Normandy's hedgerows were deceptively dangerous. From the air, they looked like simple farmland, but for advancing Allied forces, they were death traps. Tanks would get stuck, infantry would be exposed, and German defenders had perfect cover. Standard tanks couldn't break through without risking catastrophic losses. Cullen's design involved attaching large, pointed metal prongs to the front of the Sherman tank. These prongs were angled and reinforced to dig into dense soil and uproot hedges, clearing a path wide enough for both the tank and following infantry. But the genius wasn't just in the plough itself, it was in how it integrated with the Sherman's suspension and engine. Many engineers doubted it would work. Adding such weight to the front of a tank could have destroyed the suspension or slowed it down to a crawl. but Cullen recalculated the load distribution, reinforced the chassis at key stress points, and even adjusted the tracks to handle extra torque. The result? A tank that could charge through a hedge at full speed without risking mechanical failure. Beyond the plow, Cullen also made smaller yet equally critical modifications, engine enhancements that gave the tank extra torque, allowing it to push through mud, rubble and fallen trees. Quick access repair panels so that soldiers could fix minor issues under fire without specialized tools. Armor reinforcements in critical areas, providing protection where other tanks were vulnerable. Improved communication systems, allowing tank crews to coordinate more effectively with infantry. Cullen's work was the perfect combination of practical battlefield knowledge and mechanical ingenuity. He didn't just tinker for the sake of invention, he solved real problems that could mean the difference between life and death. The Hedgerow Buster became legendary because it was more than a modification. It was a philosophy. Design machines with the soldier in mind, anticipate the battlefield's challenges, and never underestimate the power of clever engineering. By the time the Allied advance gained momentum, Cullen's tanks were everywhere. Soldiers called them miracle machines, and enemy reports described them as terrifying, unstoppable engines of destruction. Cullen's innovations didn't vanish once the war ended. In fact, his work left an enduring mark on military engineering and tank design worldwide. The Hedgerow Buster had proved that creative, field-driven modifications could dramatically alter the effectiveness of existing equipment. Militaries around the world began to take note. Sometimes it wasn't about building a new tank, it was about making the old one smarter, tougher, and more adaptable. After World War II, engineers studied Cullen's designs closely. His principles reinforced structures, load redistribution, modular attachments, became foundational in post-war armoured vehicle development. Tanks designed decades later from Europe to the United States incorporated lessons first proven by Cullen in the muddy fields of Normandy. But Cullen's impact wasn't just technical. His story became legend among soldiers and engineers alike. Tales of the Mad Mechanic, who could transform broken tanks into battlefield legends, spread through the ranks, inspiring a new generation to think beyond standard procedures and rigid blueprints. Even in civilian life, his methods found a home. Engineers working on construction vehicles, bulldozers, and other heavy machinery adopted Cullen's approach. Observe the problem, adapt the machine, and test relentlessly in real conditions. This philosophy of practical ingenuity resonated far beyond wartime needs. Cullen himself never sought fame. He returned home quietly after the war, tinkering in small workshops and mentoring young mechanics. To him, it was never about the glory. It was about solving problems that mattered. Yet, today, military historians and engineers alike remember him as a figure who embodied both courage and ingenuity. By turning broken tanks into instruments of victory, Cullen didn't just help win battles, he redefined what it meant to be a military engineer. His legacy endures in every armoured vehicle that adapts, innovates, and overcomes challenges on the battlefield.